Hello, this is the third lecture for psychological behaviors of music, um, the third in the series. And today we're going to be talking about music in society or the social psychology of music, some of the aspects of how people interact with music, how they interact between each other in the presence of music, is sort of what we're looking at today. This field really started to start in the early 20th century with a guy named Farnsworth. He's mentioned in the textbook Farnsworth. And he was really interested in looking at how people develop their musical taste. If people from different groups had similar tastes, or was it totally idiosyncratic? And one of the things that he found was that people were much more objective about what made a good piece of music, more so than you would think. That there's a lot of agreement between groups in how they whether they like a piece of music or not. But this was in the early 20th century when he was around. I think he wrote his book in the 50s. Um, so when we talk about different strands or different branches of social psychology of music, we kind of have three different um, branches to look at. One is to really look at social relationships, those that within music. So that's between the performers, that's between the performers and the audience, between the teachers and pupils. So that's kind of one strand of it, of social psychology in music. The other is looking how very specific personal traits, such as personality or gender or class or age, how that can affect musical choices, such as their musical taste, instrument choice, which later in this lecture I'll talk about how gender can influence instrument selection. Um, and then the last thing is talking about practical choices, practical applications of music within social settings. So, how does music um, change social behavior? Um, does it make people more productive? Um, does it cause people to act in different ways? Does it affect consumer choices, which you should know by now that it does in some ways. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about that in the end. Um, so yeah, so we're first going to start by talking about um, performers and the audience. And so one of the big things to really get out of this chapter is this discussion of performance anxiety, to really understand that concept, which if you've been a performer, then you probably really can understand this. So some researchers a while ago came up with this idea of social facilitation, which is this idea that when you are doing a task with other people around you, then you have an incentive to do it better. And so I give the example they gave in the book: if you're running a race against other people, you're going to push yourself harder than if you're just running against the clock. And so the idea was that just having the mere presence of people around was going to make you better at doing it. However, that wasn't always true, and other researchers found that it really needed to be in a dominant task, in a task where you're trying to be the dominant person. Um, so, or you're trying to be the best in some way. So not just any task. And they also suggested that it needed to be a task where um, it needed to be a task that you already have mastered. So something that you are very good at doing. So essentially, like the runner, the actual task of running, he or she has already mastered how to make the movements. But it's then with the task itself is not difficult, but it is to push them past the others. The social facilitation, the being around the others, is what pushes them a little bit further. The problem with this is that if you have been, and it kind of talks about this obliquely in the textbook, saying if that's the case, then it would seem that the easier or the more mastered a piece of music is, the more riveting it should be. While as uh, if it was newer, and less lived in, then it might feel like that should be not as good of an experience. And so there's this idea that um, that it, if you've been in a performance ensemble, then that's normally not the case. That after you've performed something for a while, it kind of loses um, its edge. It's something that makes it special, and you have to do things in order to keep that up. So that's where on page, let's see what page it's on. On page 228, at the bottom of the page, that 12.1, there's that arc shape. We're saying like you need some arousal, in that you need to be somewhat interested in what you're doing, or there's somewhat of a challenge, so that you're paying attention, and then that you're really engaged in with what you're doing. And if there's too much arousal, then that creates anxiety, that creates just kind of breaking down your performance. So if you don't have any arousal, which that's kind of like playing the well-worn piece of music, then that's if you have zero arousal, then it's a lackluster performance. But then if you have too much arousal, you're kind of out of control, and you can't play as well as you can. So really, for a peak performance, you really need some arousal, but not too much that you get into that anxiety situation. Which there's still research being done on looking at performance anxiety. There's a lot of a lot of professional musicians that suffer from performance anxiety, and the majority of them, in order to deal with it, take beta blockers, which is it's a prescribed medication that essentially causes the heart not to speed up during episodes of arousal. So you don't have any of the physiological responses that you would have in other situations where you might be a little anxious. So again, in the book, it kind of mentions this, that while it prevents those physiological symptoms, it may also make the performance more lackluster. So, that's why some people are a little skeptical to take beta blockers to deal with it. I mean, the best way to deal with performance anxiety is trying to do like some cognitive behavioral treatment, where you essentially learn to live with the symptoms, or you try to you perform in various venues that simulate the what you're going to experience, and that's one way to kind of deal with the symptoms of a performance anxiety. When also talking about performance anxiety, it doesn't research has shown that it's not necessarily like the number of people that you're performing in front of that causes the performance anxiety. It's more about a relationship between how many people are there and who is important there, and also where they are. If you have more space between you and the audience, there tends to be less performance anxiety. If you have a small room where you're being judged in a jury, then that's much higher performance anxiety. So another thing to talk about with looking at the relationship between performers and the audience is that the audience gets a lot of information about the musical performance from visual stimuli in addition to the auditory stimulus. We kind of forget about that in our, in some ways, where we are now in technology, we see that the visual is somewhat divorced from the the sound. But 100 years ago, and you know, most of human history, you could not experience music without being in the presence of the person making it. And even the idea of portable music is a fairly new concept, or hearing something that isn't being produced by the musicians, you know, in the same room with you. That's a very, very new idea in human evolution. Um, so a lot of the information that we get from about the music comes from the social interaction with the musicians, and that is a lot of times conveyed through various gestures. Um, there was a study that looked at marimba players, and the thing about the marimba is no matter how you play it, the length of the note is the same because there's not a resonator. So when you hit the bar, it makes the sound and then it immediately decays. Um, and so they did a study where a marimba player would, you know, either have a fast gesture or have a slow gesture, where they would hit it and then kind of have um, a bit of a gesture that kind of pulls the tone. But even though there's not physically any sound, they asked people which of these were longer and shorter, or if it sounded long, if it sounded short. And the people said, oh, it sounded long, sounded short. But then when you took the visual away, they couldn't tell which ones were which because they were the same. So again, there's a lot of the information that we get is from these gestures. And a lot of these gestures, they kind of go across instruments. A lot of people do this kind of body sway for like um, expressive indications, as well as timekeeping things. The bringing the head up and like kind of insinuating a breath. Um, Also in the book, it talked about raising the fingers higher and lower. Um, so yeah, so there's definitely different gestures um, between instrumentalists or musicians in general. Um, the book then goes on to talk about ensembles without conductors and some of the social relationships within those ensembles. And I thought it was really interesting, this discussion of string quartets. And so they looked at all these different string quartets, and they found three different paradoxes. They had the paradox of leadership versus democracy, which is this idea that you know um, the first violin normally is the leader, but at the same time it's a small group, and the idea of small group playing is that everyone has a voice, so there's this kind of competing forces. There's the idea of the paradox of the second fiddle, which is um, the second fiddle is supposed to be their own musician, and highly prized by the group as well, but at the same time they're they are not the most interesting nor the most important part of the musical fabric within the string quartet. And then lastly, confrontation versus compromise, which you know um, you know this idea that you're going to fight for what you think is right for the musical idea versus compromising to work well with others. How are these things going to work out? So it's interesting to see what the research kind of says with these ideas, thinking about these string quartets. And they did find that you know a lot of a lot of successful string quartets were the ones that the first violin took on more of an administrative role and took more of a leadership role um, than the unsuccessful string quartets, where it was more egalitarian, which is kind of sad. They found that the more successful string quartets were those that the second violin was more okay being in the background a little bit and not creating consternation. And then lastly, they found that the groups that were successful they kind of worked out their problems implicitly. They didn't have full on confrontation. They were able to work out the problems, um, you know, without having without having to disrupt their kind of their way of rehearsal and performance. They were just able um, to get stuff done, and that's what it talks about too. Like the groups that were more successful, they didn't necessarily care about what the audience thought. They cared about what the ensemble thought. They saw each other as being their own audience members, as opposed to what what the groups are, what the audience might think. And then it also talks about how research with looking at the governance of wind ensembles is very different, which again is a pretty interesting um, idea to look at these, how these relationships work in these different contexts. Because wind ensembles, it does not have the same kind of hierarchical tradition, and so um, in the wind ensemble research, they didn't have, even though the flute was kind of, the flute player was looked at a lot of, or most often as the leader, there was much more times that the groups would say that they didn't have an appointed leader, that it was much more democratic. And then it just, interesting to think, well, they have um, more freedom to sit how they want to, more freedom to arrange music for their performances. So yeah, it's pretty interesting. So with yeah, I'm trying to see here. So it talks a little bit about ensembles with conductors, and I have not written down this in my notes, so I need to go back to the book for a second. I just wanted to touch upon these two ideas. Yeah, so these pages. Um, so they talk about that there's kind of two. One of the things that really helps high performing music ensembles is that they have a conductor with a transformational leadership style, which those three conditions are charisma, inspirational motivation, and intellectual stimulation. I wish there had been a little more discussion about what each of those things were, because it's hard to kind of define operationally, like what exactly do you mean when you say charisma? I mean, I think I know what they mean, because I've been in the presence of charismatic people. But hey, shh, 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 shh. Sorry, I'm taping this from home. I don't normally do it from home, but so shh, 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 shh. So yeah, it'd be interesting to kind of see what their definitions are and the like. Um, but so they talk about this transformational leadership style, but they also say that these groups um, really need a positive group mood. Now, this is an interesting, because the author talks about this, that these two things are really important for the success of the ensemble, but they really only happen kind of together. So having a transformational leadership style really doesn't do any good if you don't have this positive group mood. Same thing is that the positive group mood doesn't really do anything for the ensemble if there isn't this transformational leadership style. So we call that an interaction effect, where the performance, you've got someone with this transformational leadership style, but everyone has a bad mood about playing in this group, so the performance level is going to be down here. Same way is that if there's a positive group mood, people like playing together and they like playing um, in this ensemble, but they don't have that leadership, and again, the performance level is going to stay down here. But if both of those things come together, then the performance level is up here. That's why we call it an interaction. It happens. They have to work together to make it happen. Yeah. And then they also talk about that these gestures, um, there's research showing that conductor gestures seem to be less idiosyncratic than you think it would be. I mean, I know there's not a lot of studies on it, so I don't want to just like say, oh, well, definitely that's true, because definitely in choral world, I feel like there's a lot more idiosyncratic movement gestures where things have very particular meaning for very particular people. Um, but I think there is this idea that is accurate that there are similar ways to communicate musical ideas gesturally. So like even though the gesture may not be exactly the same, there's probably a lot of similarity. Um, I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done on this because we need to think cross culturally. We need to think about different styles of music. I'm sure at this point this has only been looked at Western music and symphonic with symphonic conductors. So that's a huge limitation, right? Because they've all been trained. There's a conducting heritage, and so you can't just be like, well, I'm gonna keep the beat like this. You know, people wouldn't understand that. So um, that's where um, I'm a little more skeptical to just say than saying like, oh, well, definitely there's no, everybody's gestures are idiosyncratic. I don't think that's true, but I think there's more work to be done to really look at where creativity and gesture is. So the text also talks about how between musicians you're dealing with timing, with synchronization, and how that is an important element of communication. That it's super important for conductors to help with the synchronization. Um, yeah, I mean synchronization or entrainment, as is sometimes called, is really important because that kind of makes sure that the music is together, right? Um, so one study was looking at so some studies where people are synchronizing movement together in musical ensembles have found, for instance, that like if singing in choirs, their breathing becomes very similar, their heart rates become very similar. I mean, this isn't like everyone does this, but there has been some evidence to show that there is this like physiological synchronization that happens when people make music together. One study that was mentioned in the book was that these two guitarists, if they are in synchrony on playing, that their actual neurons were firing at the same time. It was an ERP study, and so that's pretty interesting. Um, when looking at how instrumentalists try to synchronize with each other, there was this discussion that there are kind of leaders and followers. They did research looking at piano duos, and that one of them would kind of take the lead and the other one would follow. And that's where the gestures about raising the fingers higher to help indicate, the leader would raise the fingers higher to help indicate um, where the beat was. The text also talks about prioritize integrative attending, which that means you have a lot of things going on about you. You're reading the score in front of you, you're looking at the conductor, you're also attending to your horn. I'm playing the clarinet all of a sudden. So you've got all these different tasks going on, and so you have to prioritize what is going to help you with the task of staying with the group. And so that could be by looking at the conductor. That could be by looking at your score. So they were saying that part of the synchronization, the part of or synchronizing is a result of being able to do all those tasks and attend to what the sound is and what the conductor's doing. that without that trait, it would be very hard to have the synchronization. And they mentioned that conductors are very good um, at this prioritized integrative attention attending thing, that they are able to kind of that they notice when something is not going the way it's supposed to. Like if there was a on set somewhere that wasn't supposed to, that they can attend to that and they can address it. Um, so that's a little interesting. So that's pretty much what we're talking about as far as how performers interact with each other, how they um, interact with the audience. Today we're not really going to talk about the student teacher relationship. We're going to talk about that more during development, because that's an important aspect, but we're not going to talk about that today. We are going to talk a little bit about, so as we talk about how these personal differences can affect musical choices. So first, let's talk about music and gender. And some of my research has looked at gender, and so I find it very fascinating. And as a choir person, it's not something that I talked about a lot when I was teaching, but it's something that was, you're always aware of. We're always trying to recruit boys in choir, and so I think that's one thing that I've always been thinking about when I was a practicing teacher. Is like, how do we do this better? How do we make it more or less of a liability for boys to join choir? So by the age of 5, and maybe even before that, most children associate various musical activities as being masculine or feminine. Where they get those cues from, who knows? I mean, maybe they get it from their parents. Maybe they get it from other kids. Maybe they get it from the media. They've seen, a boy play a saxophone and a girl play a piano. Like they get these messages wherever they get them from. So very, very early on, they associate different music activities as being masculine or feminine. Now, overall, music is seen in our society, or by, I don't know if children see music as being feminine, but definitely in adults, overall, music is seen to be a feminine activity for whatever reason. And so, as children grow up in an elementary school, it seems very natural that they're going to be drawn to instruments that align with their gender group, just because they don't want to cross those gender norms. So you have, the feminine typical instruments are, flute, clarinet, violin is considered feminine. Piano is considered feminine, and then so things that have higher timbres and playing higher octaves, those are the ones that are seen as more feminine. Oboe is considered feminine, and then things that are lower, or things that are percussive, are considered more masculine. So trumpet, trombone, tuba, saxophone is considered masculine. Drums is very masculine. Guitar is masculine. So they're very much drawn to the instruments that are with their gender group. Now, in the book, it talks about a study where they showed mismatch. So it was an intervention study. They were trying to see if they could get more interest in students to be interested in instruments other than those that align with their gender group. So they showed them videos of, like, a man playing a flute, a woman playing guitar. So the idea was to really help students to see that they could cross gender norms. Well, they didn't really get the results that they were expecting, because they didn't see any more interest in in the instruments that were for the other gender group. What they did find was that the um, instruments that they showed, so for instance, for the guitar with a woman playing the guitar, boys then were less interested in playing guitar because there was a woman playing it. So it kind of had the opposite reaction that they had. Now, one thing that is interesting about the study that they don't really talk about in the book is that it does show that these that you can influence interest in something. And so perhaps maybe it was just that the intervention itself was so weak. It was just, this one video of showing them that it didn't really have the intended effect. But if they, showed models of people playing instruments from an early age through elementary school, then maybe it could have an effect that's more promising than what happens in that one study. Um, yeah, and we're going to read. Oh, not in this class. In the other class, we're going to read a chapter from my dissertation that's kind of on this stuff, but I won't talk about this here. So, um, yeah. One of the other things about gender and instruments is that socially, it's much more socially. There's less social liability for girls to cross gender norms than for boys. So you'll see more girls cross the instrument gender norms. And I see this all the time in high schools. You have, a handful of girls playing trumpet or trombone or percussion, but you see much fewer boys playing flute. And you'll see some boys playing clarinet. But, and one thing too, like those studies that looked at how feminine or masculine is a continuum. So even though clarinet might be viewed as feminine, it's not as viewed as feminine as flute. So flute is definitely one of the highest. Singing is also on that very, very it's very high on, or it's seen as being very feminine as well. So yeah, so like I was saying before, one of the things about when I was teaching is about recruiting boys, and in a recent study um, looking at who takes choir, band, and orchestra in high schools, they found that choirs, you had about 2 girls for every boy, so almost twice as many girls and boys in choir programs. But they also found the same thing happening in orchestras. So orchestras are just as unbalanced between boys and girls as choirs. Bands had more girls than boys, but it wasn't to the same extent as orchestras. So our music classes, our performing music classes overall in high school are very much more balanced or unbalanced, with many more girls in music classes. So as researchers, we should be thinking, well, why is that? Is that because this is the product of music being seen as feminine or less masculine, as opposed to something like athletics or sports or other elective activities? I don't know. Yeah, it's something to think about. In the book, they talk about how jazz, is definitely one of these where girls are definitely not represented equally, and that's partly because of this instrument choice. The book talks about the study, which if you're interested in jazz, you should read the study itself. It's pretty interesting. It's only 10 years old or so. Her name is McKeague, Mckeage, and so she was the one that looked at. I think she started. She surveyed college instrumentalists and asked them questions about their high school jazz experience, and a lot of them said things like, well, I wanted to be in jazz band, but I didn't play a jazz band instrument. My teacher wouldn't let me in unless I learned, I had to audition on a different instrument, which part of me is like, well, the teacher should try to, accommodate in some ways, but, I understand the real world. Like um, I don't know. I have mixed feelings about it. But yeah, it's very sad that it seems like there are lots of young women that want to participate in jazz, but they can't either because of their instrument or they don't feel welcome in within that context. Um, One of the studies said that girls report not feeling as confident in improvising as boys do, but in other studies they found that girls are just as competent as boys. So that's more, you know, a product of them feeling, they're getting messages somewhere that they should not feel confident about the work that they do. Um, but yeah. And the book also talks about this disparity between the genders with music composition, and it talks about the Goldberg paradigm, which you might remember that study where um, they gave people different uh, they gave them compositions to evaluate, and they gave them either men's names or women's names, and they automatically liked the men's names better. But then if they gave biography about the women or men, then they liked the women's piece more because it seemed to be that they had overcome some sort of they came over some sort of obstacles in their musical career. So definitely interesting as far as that goes. It definitely shows how the societal constructs, it definitely, we like to think, oh, we base everything on its merits, but it's not true. For some reason, if it's a woman's name by it, there's this natural tendency to not value it as highly as if it has a man's name by it. So that's something we should really be aware of and work towards as citizens of our country. Okay, so now we're going to talk for just a few minutes about consumer behavior and applying music to certain social situations. So some of the earliest uses of music for some sort of commercial endeavor was in the early 20th century. They wanted to see if music would help factory workers be more productive. Would it raise morale? Would it make them more efficient? All these sorts of things. So music was really seen as this way to try to help make people become better workers. And so so that's kind of a not a great a great place to start. But the thing that is clear is that it does seem like music within social environments can really influence behavior and activity. In the book, it really talks about that, how tempo can really play a part in activity. So they talked about that having a slow tempo in the supermarket, that it led to people taking more time, and spending more money. But having faster tempos, they were more active and they got through things more quickly. Shh, come here. Shh, shh, shh. That also was true for soft music. In restaurants, they found that Slow music led to them eating more slowly, but they did spend more time at the bar or ordering drinks. But faster music, there was more turnover and things. And so, it really depends on what kind of restaurant you want. If you want people to come in and out, Roxy, shh, shh, shh. If you want people to come in and out quickly, then having faster music would be better. Um, they also found that music within social situations would have an impact on time perception, where if it's loud, fast, and complex, that it requires more processing, and so it actually feels like slower amount of time. They also found that that if you like it, that if you enjoy the music that you're listening to, you actually think more time has passed, which is kind of the opposite of what you think would happen. And so this is actually used, so you might wonder why, when you're put on hold, that it's kind of this Muzak-y thing that you really don't care for. But what they found is that music that music that is not something that you are instantly drawn to, that it actually reduces stress and irritation, and that it kind of forms this sedative type like effect on you, and you feel like less time has gone on. You'll probably notice that it's very repetitive, and that's to help you not notice that you have listened to it 800 times. So yeah. So advertisers and marketers, they really try to use music to help you make consumer decisions that is essentially hoping that you'll buy things. So what they do is they try to use some moderately complex music, because that will help you, because people normally have a positive reaction to moderately complex music, and they're attracted to it, and they're led to more visits to go back to the place where they encounter that. They also try to, music is sometimes used as a source of arousal, and they're either trying to, to make your state of arousal be similar to something they're selling, or to alter the current state. So, if there is a truck advertisement that has kind of an arousing music with it, that's to kind of get you in that adventurous spirit of seeing you in the truck. Hold on one second. Okay, just have a few more minutes, so I'm trying to. She's starting to whine. Now, so there are kind of three reasons for why music can influence, or three theories on why music can influence your buying behavior. And one is classical conditioning, which classical conditioning, essentially, if you remember Pavlov's dogs, it's, if you put these two stimuli together, when you put one of them around and then only present one of them, the reaction will happen. So, you ring the bell and the dog salivates. So how this was done in commercials is like they